Deus Majestatis Intabuit.
Welcome to another episode of Two Trade School Trads, where we are going into another episode on our deep dive of the French Revolution, distinguishing the real history from the narrative. I'm your host, Jack.
And I'm Alan.
And we're going to get back into our deep conversation about the French Revolution. So where we left off is we talked about really the spiritual influences that came about and what were really attacked and how it was kind of traded for secular values and enlightenment and thoughts of reason. And really where we kind of left off was, here's what all happened, here's what was going on, here's kind of the historical background to it. So what really happened? Well, in a spiritual and religious sense, the real attacking point was the civil constitution of the clergy.
Now, did that come before the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen or after?
No, that came after. So the Declaration of Man and of the Citizen, that was kind of their kind of foundational document. Think of it as our Declaration of Independence. Really, that was saying, hey, we're actually doing this. We have authority. That was kind of their version of it. And evidently, Jefferson helped draft that document. So,
well, that was their Remember the Alamo moment, was the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Well, maybe not Remember the Alamo moment, but that was their banner right there.
Right, that was kind of their kind of like, hey, we're standing up, we're actually going and doing this. But the civil constitution of the clergy was a document that was passed by the Estates General that said, hey, we don't want to get rid of the church, but we want to control it. But they kind of wanted to survey and see what was really going on, what kind of the state of the church was. So they put this document out saying, hey, the Catholic Church is now under state control. You no longer report to Rome, you report to France. And we need to make sure that your loyalties are where they need to be. You need to take an oath reaffirming everything that we've just laid out in this document. Now, this document really, a lot of it is formative. It's just saying, hey, here's how things are operated, here's how elections happen. Evidently, it says that explicitly that you no longer report to Rome. It is the government that you report to, or either your eldest bishop in the country. And there were salaries that were offered saying, hey, the government will pay you a certain amount depending on the population of the city that you're in or which archdiocese you were in. It also redrew boundaries. Now, a lot of dioceses, a lot of these boundaries were just outright cut. And they said they're no longer recognized. These positions are vacant now. They no longer exist. And some of these clergy that took this oath just up and said, all right, I guess I don't have a position anymore. My office is gone.
I think it's astounding how actually radical and secular this document was for what France was just a couple years ahead of this. I mean, this is actually like earth-shattering, like we're talking like this quakes the foundations of everything France is built on. Like, this isn't a mere piece of legislation. This is basically like we're re-scripting France we're creating it out of nothing again. Like that. That's kind of the gist I've gotten and how Jack explains it here. The revolutionaries basically set out to rewrite France just through their legislation. I mean, kind of first through the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which I believe came out in 1789 or 1790. The following year, it was followed up by the Constitution of the Clergy, or the Civil Constitution of the Clergy. And it's kind of this general progression, but something happens and it gets out of control.
So, Alan, let's say you are a French clergyman in the Revolution, and there's a decree saying you need to take this oath against Rome, against your vows, pledging your allegiance to the Revolution. How many clergy would you think took that oath? Let's just say priests. How many priests do you think took that oath?
I would hope it would be few. Obviously, there are fallen men in the priesthood. Obviously, I would hope it'd be like less than 10%.
Yeah, that's what I would assume coming out. But the estimates range that over half of the clergy took that oath. It's estimated that about 54% of priests just decry and just say, yep, we want to save our own skin. We're going to pledge our allegiance to the state and not to Rome. That's absurd. Are you kidding me? 54%?
It's basically like apostasy too, in what the papacy stood very strongly against this. But that's a chilling number to think that over half of the priests of France are willing to compromise with this new government, and they are going to go against many of their confreres and many of their superiors, which include none other than the Pope.
Right, and the Pope at the time, Pope Pius VI, absolutely said, no, you cannot take this oath. This is heretical. This is awful. Do not take this oath. And most of the bishops in France at the time didn't. They say 4 of the 135 bishops in France at the time did take the oath. They say 1 recanted. But really, if you recant after that, you know it is. The Pope decreed that it's bad. Can you even accept a recantation at that point?
This kind of heralds back to the old days, back like with some of those early heresies in the church, where there was like groups that would split off and be like, well, no, they can't come back in, you're being too lenient, versus the groups that would split off in the church and say, you need to be more lenient. This poses a perpetual problem of reconciling the sinner. Now the church does forgive as the Lord forgives, but it does beg a question worth reflecting on, which can plague us down to this day. Like, if half your priests are willing to sign away their vows and their beliefs, how do you just move on? You can't just forget that half of your priests apostatize.
Right. And I think this was really, like I said, a surveying to see, heralding back to my previous point of this complacency, this comfort. How much could they get away with? How much could this new secular government take over? And I think this was really just a test to see what was out there. What could they take? Who could they really bring in right away with no real trouble?
It's very interesting. In this time frame, it's always an adage of the church that, dark times make the lights brighter, and dark spiritual times tend to produce many saints. Very interestingly, the works of Louis de Montfort, and very famously True Devotion to Mary and The Secret of the Rosary and such works, promoting Mary and devotion, they were written before the Revolution. Now they are somehow saved, and I think they were even like buried underground or something crazy, and they're blown into the light right after the Revolution, and they kind of set the stage for a new revival. But you have this spiritual formation beginning in some who have to live through this dark time in the church, and though there's this darkness of the what the church has to suffer through, this is the grounds for a new springtime, actually. And you got famous saints like Blessed Pierre Faberge, who was a martyr in 1794, right at the end of the Terror, who died in the hulks, which were old naval ships. They were pulled ashore and used as extra prisons for priests that refused to recant their vows. And I think about his heroic witness and dying a martyr, also extending to the nuns of Compiègne, and going all the way to future saints like Saint John Vianney, who are not yet priests, but this is a young man getting formed in this dark time to be a Catholic in France, and to see everything he knows under attack. His worldview has got to just be shaking. I mean, like, half of the priests in his country have just signed with this new rebellion against everything he knew growing up. And the church is divided right down the middle in that regard. And who do you trust? Who do you believe? Are these priests right in signing on with this new rebellion just to be able to hopefully provide the sacraments, even though they're standing up against the Pope on this? Or do you stay with the Pope and disavow half the priests, or more than half, because many of the good priests who didn't take the oath went to the prisons or were exiled, or worse even than that, executed. It's a very interesting thing to ponder, how the Lord can bring such good out of such evil. And as we'll get to shortly, there's going to be a spiritual flowering. But first, we must dive a little bit deeper yet into the dark age of the Revolution.
Right. And the Reign of Terror really came to an end when the nuns of Compiègne really embraced their martyrdom. And it's noted that the crowd was visibly just kind of shocked by this. They kind of fell silent. It's like, why are we doing this? Why are we killing these innocent nuns whose only real grave crime is just they are believed to be anti-revolutionary just because of their affiliation?
And they're just loyal to their vows. It's actually, it calls to mind for me, there's a movie about this called The War of the Vendée, and which is mainly about the Vendée Revolution against the French Revolution. But at the end, there's a very touching scene in this movie, which is primarily filled with kid actors that my brothers and I would watch growing up. And the ending scene is these nuns sacrificing themselves just piously and selflessly, knowing that it is the will of their husband, our Lord, that their martyrdom would be used to satisfy the Lord's vengeance in a way that's not probably the right terminology, but that they would offer themselves as a willing sacrifice to earn back in a way the mercy and goodwill of our Lord. And shortly, in literally a novena's time between their execution and the end of the revolution is noted, which is that's astounding. And that the scene at the end of the movie is a touching scene in how selflessly and actually joyously these nuns offered themselves for the end of the Reign of Terror, which was bloody and swept through the majority of France. There's a few areas that managed to be saved, but it was very whimsical and not rational at all, even though it claimed to be the great age of reason coming in.
I think the Vendée Rebellion is the answer to the question many people ask is, did anybody really do anything when they see half their clergy disobeying their vows to obedience, when they see all their loyal priests being exiled or even executed, when they can't even get the sacraments? What do? And I think this is one of the big answers is they formed really an armed wing where they said, no, we're going to fight back. We're going to do something about this. We're not just going to sit here and take this.
The Catholic laity just took up arms at one point. They just got fed up enough, and they're just like, you know what? Enough of this crap. We're going to restore the old that we knew was true. And I mean, it's not perfect, but we can make do with this. And this is enough for us to live our lives and get to heaven, hopefully. And when all else failed, they did resort to arms. They're being persecuted. Their priests are getting shackled up and taken away. And you see this all throughout France, but the most famous one erupts in 1793 at the height of the terror in the west of France, right along the coast, right next to Nantes and the sparkling ocean, a very peaceful countryside, very peaceful peasantry. It was a very cultured section, very richly Catholic and very staunch defenders of the monarchy. And they rise up to the occasion. They form the Catholic monarchical militia and stand up to the Great Rebellion against all that they knew. And this counter-revolution is very fascinating. These are literally peasants. These aren't backed militias by, these aren't mercenaries. This is not orchestrated. This is the actual organic uprising of the faithful, of the peasantry, actually. Like, these were the humblest and poorest people, not wanting to watch their economy and their church fall into ruin like this. They stand up, take up arms, and they're able to see is like at one point up to 20% of modern-day France is held by the Vendée revolutionaries, who are counter-revolutionaries to the new government that took over power.
Right, and I think that in and of itself is a great and noble way to die, if anything, because eventually they were suppressed and they were killed en masse. There's a lot of first-hand accounts of drownings and being floated out on pontoons that have been purposely sunk, and just brutal deaths. But still, I think there's something noble in that, where when all else fails, when everything is crumbling down, you stand up and fight, and you can die for Christ. And I think that in and of itself is a great martyrdom that comes with just everything is crumbling. What do? You fight, and whether or not you succeed, you still know that if you die, that you die in quite literally a very great and noble way.
It's definitely worth the chance. And like Jack and I both appreciate, especially like we are dual beings in that we have spiritual natures or we have a soul and a body. And at some point there comes a point where we have to take things physically into our own hands. And these men, they stepped up and lived up to their masculine roles to protect their families and their nation. Stepped up and went right to war. And this is a very, it's actually, like you said, it's a very noble thing, but it takes into account kind of it's like the beauty of the church, the genius of the sacraments in the church, how they are a great spiritual significance, but the Lord allots us, due to our human nature, He allots us these physical, tangible signs as well. We get to receive the Eucharist. You can smell the incense at Mass. You hear the bells. You see the light coming in through the stained glass windows. There's like a physical element to all this too. The church isn't just spiritual. And when it comes under physical attack, there are times you have to take up arms and fight back physically. Now, sadly, the Vendée Revolution is not successful, but they made their point. They made everybody think, and they were temporarily successful, and their names ought to live on in the annals of time for future generations. They should be talked about in the halls of the great and mighty among the earth until the end of time. But there's something vastly superior in these men who are willing to stand up to this direct assault, knowing that their chances of victory are slim. But they are a people of faith. They know what their duty is, what their calling is to defend, and we ought to look to these men more. This sort of example, should future problems come to us, and certainly problems should. Hopefully, we shouldn't have to go to those lengths.
Right, and I don't know if in our time we'll get to anywhere near the extreme that it happened, where everything seems to be collapsing around you. But still, I think that in and of itself, that example is truly what every Catholic man should have been looking towards at that time, what really the right answer was.
And there's something built into our nature, too, just the valiance and the nobility of rising up to defend all that you hold true. And what better way? I can't think of any cause more worth fighting for than to save your own country, your own church, your own families from just utter ruthlessness that's looking to overturn everything for an experiment.
Right, and I think too that we can take a little bit of example from these men and what they did in kind of our modern lives. We see plenty of attacks on many fronts. I think these men give us a great example on what we should do in these times, and not just run away, but to fight. Many times in our modern lives, there are many issues that need people to fight. Our instincts really are to fight or flight, and you can run away and it feels comfortable. You get away from danger, but at the same time, it will just continue to spread. And unless somebody is there to thwart evil, it'll just continue to roam free.
Yeah, and I think this is a point that at least we will try to emphasize more. Like, it has been tried too many times to just coexist with evil in the world, and there comes a point in time where, well, fine, it's been tried, but evil doesn't want to coexist with us. Evil doesn't want to coexist with good and civilization in the world. It is always actively trying to get the upper hand to crush good. And eventually we just have to rise to the occasion and try to crush evil ourselves, because there is no true coexistence between good and evil. One must triumph, and that is the great struggle of this world.
And at some point, you have to realize that tolerance is endorsement. If you are being tolerant of these evils, of these bad things, it's an endorsement. It just is.
Anyone living in this time, their intentions may have been good, but they are not vindicated by history for letting revolutionaries trample and guillotine and pillage and worse, like all throughout France. Like, it is the men of the Vendée that stood up, that are vindicated by history for having the the guts and the willingness to stand up for their beliefs against evil, albeit it was unfortunately unsuccessful.
I want to briefly mention some of these big figures, mostly Robespierre. Everybody puts a big emphasis on him, and that he was the real architect of both the Reign of Terror and the early startings of the French Revolution. And kind of the history that is commonly attributed to him is that he was one of the main figures. He politically kind of organized some of the starting governments, and he was kind of the architect of the Reign of Terror. He made lists, and eventually that was his downfall, as he made lists that he claimed had many of the politicians in it, and they turned on him and ultimately guillotined him.
Now, that is the narrative. Now, obviously, the historical facts are true. I mean, he was actually a victim of the guillotine. But the interesting thing to note, which Belloc brings up frequently in his writings on this subject, the French Revolution is much more complicated than being the great masterpiece, the symphony masterpiece of one man. Robespierre was labeled as the face of the revolution because he had a very large personality. He rose to the top of groups that he was in naturally. I mean, he had one of those personalities that you either love or despise. He quickly rose in, but he never really wielded power. And his enemies, who grew very quickly in number during the Reign of Terror, turned him into the face of all that was bad in the country. And that propaganda, although he wasn't that great of a man, stuck with through the end of time, and like down to this day, everyone thinks that he was the big bad thing. Actually, no, he was just literally the figurehead of one of the factions vying for control. And the French Revolution is much more complicated, and there was much less direct orchestrated control within the revolution. Now, I've said it before, but the French Revolution was entirely orchestrated from the starts. But once the revolution started, it got really out of hand and spiraled out of control. I mean, it was just the snowball going down the hill and getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and big enough that nobody could stop it. And the people that had orchestrated it started fighting amongst themselves. And it's in this infighting you have the Reign of Terror, because they couldn't agree on what legislation to push through. Robespierre was a propaganda figure only. He was smeared. I'm not endorsing anything that he stood for, but I will wish to clear his name that he was not the grand designer of the French Revolution. And actually, there's evidence that he was a moderate on some things and actually was promoting the end of the guillotine and the Reign of Terror, which might have earned him his unfortunate fate.
Yeah, and of course, towards the end, we get into Napoleon, which is way beyond the scope of this episode. But we kind of come to the point where he crowns himself emperor. And at the time, the Catholic Church is accepted back into France, but still kind of handicapped. And really what we see at the end of the French Revolution is this time when Napoleon comes to power, and really the main event that really summarizes the state of France at that time was when Napoleon was going to be coronated Emperor of France. And Pope Pius VII is present. All the accoutrements that come with a coronation are there. And right as Pope Pius VII is about to crown Napoleon as emperor, he takes the crown out of his hands and crowns himself, which is undoubtedly symbolism.
It's that is really a fruit of the revolution, and placing all of our strength and all of our hope in human means, political means, rather than the spiritual. Napoleon is a product of the revolution in that regard. He sought to restore civilization in the church, but he did not wish to restore the spiritual authority of the church. And this would live on and plague France. This kind of leads us into our discussion of the implications afterwards of the French Revolution. We'll go through the political implications first, and then kind of go into the spiritual and cultural implications that this had on France, Europe, and all of the West.
Right, Europe was thrown into chaos and war at the time. many dead. Infrastructure is just devastated.
The church lost tons of ground. It basically lost France, although the peasantry did hang on and was able to make a revival. But politically, the short term was terrible.
And of course, at that time, the church, most of its lands and riches were confiscated and used for revolutionary purposes, mostly used to try and get a new currency started.
Overall, it was anti-civilization oriented chaos. It was organized chaos to destroy civilization in France. Now, it was about 75% successful. France was able to bounce back, but this setback, in a way, France has never recovered from, and it has never returned to that unity and cohesion between faith and the public realm. This is something you never see with the church, this chaos, this pillaging, the burnt, one can just note that it's basically always the enemies of the Catholic Church that are destroying culture in all of their wars. It's not the church through its peaceful and logical progression through society. It is the forces opposed to it that take to these violent and drastic means to accomplish their ends.
Right, there's a lot of bad in a short period of time. More kind of midterm. Was there anything good that came out of this?
There were some positive effects in the midterm, politically speaking. Famously, Count von Metternich, the famed Austrian statesman, established the Concert of Europe following the defeat of Napoleon, and Europe had a chance to catch its breath from all these constant wars, and because the revolution in France did not just stay there, it engulfed the entire continent in wars with revolutionary armies. Like during the days of Robespierre, we're marching through Germany. Like Napoleon was an officer of the revolution himself and went through Italy and Egypt and subdued Rome at one point. Europe has a chance to catch its breath again. Following Napoleon's defeat, they can reset. It looks like the revolutionaries have kind of lost their wind for a while. The pendulum swings back, and there is a great resurgence of conservatism, monarchism, and this is effectively organized into a sort of League of Nations sort of thing, in a way similar to the modern EU, but much different. Von Metternich set up what he called the Concert of Europe, which really did put Austria as the new center stage, as the bulwark of Catholicism and traditionalism in Europe. And this is in 1815, and it has a good solid 15-year run. There's a little hiccup, but it's able to kind of stretch all the way to about 1850. So there's at least a good 30 to 35 years that the Concert of Europe held Europe in peace, and they had a strong promotion of traditional monarchies, balanced and sometimes even Enlightenment-style monarchies, but it frowned on republics and this new progressive liberalism that had been in the upswing since the Reformation. And for one last time in European history, monarchies are revered, and they are the most highly praised and most highly viewed form of government. And the stable peace that this all brings reigns over Europe for at least a generation, and enough for Europe to begin a rebuilding.
Right, I think this is a big shock to many of the monarchs in the surrounding countries, and that kind of leads into the War of the Coalitions, the many of them that there were, and really it was kind of them saying, we need to band together. If this can happen to France, this can happen to any of us.
And that is a very real fear that gripped all of them, and we actually saw a very interesting thing with the Tsar of Russia reaching out to the Pope, right? Right after the defeat of Napoleon, like, we need to form like this Christian alliance of monarchies to preserve what is good in the world. I mean, there's some theological differences between us, but like the Tsar was even willing to join Catholicism for this sake. Now, there's a host of reasons why that was never able to happen, and of course much politics, but Russia just about came back to the church in the early 1800s over this. The papacy was sprung into right in the center of this Concert of Europe now, because it was seen as a stabilizing traditional factor, and it was the main target of the revolutionaries. So it was welcomed back in. England, which had been very much a progressive country against kind of the normal social orders and status quo of Europe, came back and saw this as well. And they're like, well, I mean, even though our monarchy is quite constitutional and parliamentary, not like some of the more European-style monarchies, we don't want any of this chaos happening here either. So there's a sudden banding together of all the nations of Europe, which is a very positive thing. And it allowed Europe some flourishing time and allowed culture to revive a little bit. And interestingly enough, it repaired the broken status of the papacy on the diplomatic stage of the world, which had been destroyed by the French Revolution and the conquest of Rome, and the Pope during which time the Pope had been brought to Paris, and he was shunned by the world and seen just as a plaything of Napoleon. And it's a sudden reversal, and the church is looked at again with shining eyes, and all seems to be well for a little while.
Right. And going way into the future, and what came of it now? I mean, France is a shell of itself. I mean, what are they on their 8th constitution? And they've greatly amended their current one plenty of times. They're just in that same kind of pit where it's like, we don't know what we want to do. We just want to throw different things at it until it sticks. Kind of like in the early revolution, they tried one thing, and then they kind of, especially on the religious front, they had 2 of the cults going on. Europe and the West in general became more atheistic. There were more Masonic revolutions and other based revolutions that washed across the Americas and Europe over the next 50 years. That real age of revolutions began at that time, in that time period.
Especially in Latin America, the church would lose much ground, politically speaking, to these new secular republics, which were directly opposed to the state's influence on public affairs. And this is the long-term effect now, because the concert of Europe would break apart eventually. I mean, when Metternich died and different factions and a new generation was coming in, and we saw more revolutions, and these especially hit the Americas really hard.
Right, and then, of course, the Holy Roman Empire at that time dissolved in 1806. Though it would linger in the form of Austria for another 110 years or so, that figurehead holding Germany together nominally was lost and gave way for Prussia to form the German Empire, which most agreed didn't contribute much that would last to European civilization.
That's a little bit more true than I think even us more lenient towards the Germans would want to say. But the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire officially in 1806 by Napoleon was a very devastating factor, because it would lead to this. It opened a power vacuum in the center of Europe that Germany would try to fill in a new way, which not Germany, but actually the Prussians would try to fill in creating Germany. And it led to a lot of power struggles and many wars in Europe, and really can be, in a way, 2 world wars traced from this. And this is due to Napoleon and the French Revolution, which kicked him off.
And the church would get prosecuted in the future, and there was an arms race that wasn't really seen before the rise of Germany, and that arms race would begin, and escalation of just secularization across Europe and the West just continued to accelerate.
That is one of the most enduring legacies, especially in the political realm of the French Revolution, is it kicked off this event, and Europe never was able to reset to where it was in the 18th century. There was some stability. It never reset from 1789. And what was undone there, even though they would even briefly put a monarch back on the throne of France, it couldn't be undone. This was permanent. And since then, how many of us can think of republics in Europe versus Catholic monarchies? There are no functioning Catholic monarchies in Europe right now outside of the Papal States, now known as the Vatican, whereas republics are everywhere. And although the republican form of government has been allowed by the church and can even be a decent form of government, the very grave flaw is that they are divorced from the church, and they do not accept the church's influence in their realms. And this is a grave problem that continues down to this day, which was first really put into effect in the French Revolution.
Right, and those were all really the political effects. There are some very grave spiritual and cultural effects that came, both in the short and long term. Short term, I mean, many priests and religious were apostatized. Churches were seized and sacked. Religious vows were forsaken and trampled. And many priceless Catholic art pieces, literature, architecture was lost.
The actual amount of culture that was destroyed during the French Revolution it's rather sobering to look at the number of churches that were destroyed. And yes, the hit on the church itself was devastating. It would take them generations to rebuild from the loss of priests and the loss of land that happened. They never really got much of that land back. They had to earn it and buy it back from when it had just been stolen from them. And yeah, it's very interesting, like I brought up earlier, right after this revolutionary period, though, when the church in France is rebuilding and there's all this negative, I mean, the church has just been literally razed to the ground in many places, actually physically. There's some aids that come in, and we have a great resurgence in spirituality of coming out of France. Like Louis de Montfort is behind this, but we see just this flowering of saints that, especially moving into the midterm effects culturally and spiritually, that we'll get into in just a second. But on the one last note on the short term, monarchy kind of being the theme of these couple episodes here, the overthrowing of the monarchy was probably the most dire cultural effect in a way. The rights of the French people that had been protected under the monarchy, the actual rights, like the right to worship in the true church and try to attain sainthood, these have been trampled on by every single republic that has tried to fill the old spot of the monarchy. France has had no success. And culturally speaking and spiritually speaking, that damage has been irreplaceable, and France has never recovered in that regard, despite the flowering of the church that would start here now in the midterm post-effects of the revolution.
Yeah, I mean, of course, we had some positive effects. You had the heroic witnesses of some saints during the revolution. The church would gain ground again, and more saints would flower in the 19th century. Convents were being overflowing in the mid-century. The amount of vocations that were being filled at that time was huge.
Saints, like already mentioned, John Vianney, they were pivotally formed during these years of persecution, and their efforts and their great formation during this time frame actually would bear fruit in later decades in France. And there was some major success in restoring the faith to France, and many people achieved sanctity in the process. Saint Therese, the Little Flower of Lisieux, she very famously came from France, although she was closer to 80 to 90 years between the end of the revolution, or from the beginning of the revolution and her life.
Great saint.
Very interestingly enough, we had a large series of French apparitions that started, beginning kind of with Catherine Labouré and the Miraculous Medal in 1830, but there's also La Salette in 1846, Lourdes in 1858, Pont-Main in 1871, and some more. There's this, something happens, and Mary intercedes for her people in these tough and challenging times. And something is definitely going on. The pendulum is swinging back. You have this Romantic era culture setting in Europe in the early 1800s, and that's kind of just the natural following on the heels of the political and philosophical backlash of reason literally in arms burning down civilization, or supposed reason. And this coincides with a major revival of Catholicism all across Europe. The intensity of faith as practiced and as encouraged by the state is led by Romantic poets and artists who they basically rediscover the coherence and the beauty of the true faith in this. There's a shocking tidal wave all across Europe. It does spill across the Atlantic into the U.S. a little bit, but not quite as much.
Yeah, this wasn't just a French thing. This did correspond to the English-speaking world as well. Everyone was looking on in awe at this event, and they got to feel a little bit of the effects of it as well. And this sparked all across Europe this convulsive reaction to terror and atrocities of the French Revolution. They didn't want that in their countries. They didn't want that in their governments. No. For a moment, Europe caught its breath and could really breathe deeply anew that we don't want this. We know what we need to do. Let's just get our footing here.
In this romantic era, as it's been called in Europe, you have these giants that are produced in the intellectual realm. Like the first one that comes to mind for me is John Henry Newman of Britain. These men, they convert to Catholicism during this tidal wave that rushes across Europe in the early 1800s, and they become these intellectual giants amidst this resurgence. This is all sparked due to Europe's just convulsive reaction to the terror and the grave atrocities of the French Revolution. And Europe tries to turn a page here. Now, we'll see, though, that sadly this did not last, and the radicals would seem to have the last say.
Yeah, and going into the future and beyond, the European radicals saw this revolution as their victory. This was big. They were able to overthrow such a steadfast and entrenched Catholic monarchy. They were able to get rid of that and put in their own government on their own authority. This was their victory. This was huge. This empowered them through many other revolutions that took inspiration from them and said, if we can do that to France, who else can fall? And more revolutions did follow. In France, again, it continued in 1830. And all of Europe finds itself in similar scenarios. And then the revolutions turn successful in lands like Italy and Germany. And these revolutions keep on going, and they're stoked. And the church ends up calling a council because of it.
There's definitely a grave crisis in Europe. It takes about 2 generations after the French Revolution ends before a new wave of revolutionaries looks to the past and like, we can do this again, guys. Let's do this, man. And like the church is like, whoa, you don't need to do this. The leaders have become complacent again politically, and you end up with this another spiral out of control. And I mean, after it kind of briefly preludes, and we have a little bit of peace, but then the downhill spiral begins again in the middle of the 1800s, and the church is going to find itself in a very diminished state by the end of the century, once the initial shock and horror stemming from the violence of the revolution wears off. And this will sadly find a new culmination in World War I, where you see reason in arms again. You see these great rational men. We have got human means and technology, and we're great. And what do? We slaughter each other in the trenches in World War I. It's a very dark and grave thing when humanity throws off God. And it's actually a form of modernism, thinking that we right now, we have all the capacities to make society and make the world exactly conform to us, and it'll just be great, right?
Yeah. And I think, too, that the Catholic Church never recovered the amount of power and influence that it really had at that time. From then on, it's just been downward. Few resurgence, few comebacks, but never to the extent of what, like, pre-revolution France was.
And in a sense, Europe loses its braking system on this progressive and this Enlightenment extremism. The church was the brakes on this for quite a long time, but it was basically ripped out. In France, it no longer had pull in England. It was diminishing now in Austria. Italy had just been overthrown. The church found itself in a very dire state. Now, overall, this is a very oversimplification, as there are many other factors involved in the French Revolution. But the philosophical world was very rocked by the revolution, and ever since then, it has lingered in the subconsciousness of Western thought. And this is the real and the most important history we have drawn out of the revolution, the most important implications that affect our modern world today.
Yeah, and I think this is the beginning of revolutions. Not the beginning per se, but this is really a successful one in the eyes of the secular world, and it will just continue to break off and take inspiration from this. And from then on, Europe has changed. The West is different.
How easy do you think it would be to go back to prevent for these future things from happening?
I don't think we can. I think at this point, Europe was tested. The old world was tested, and it failed. And I don't think it can ever get back to that former glory unless there is some divine assistance.
It seems too true. Of course, we both would love to see Europe return to the faith and return back to its roots, but it might need another awakening before that can happen. That will wrap it up for today. We hope you enjoyed this episode. We've been talking about the French Revolution, and we've got some great episodes coming up. Make sure to catch our next episode, and you definitely won't want to miss that.
What kind of topics are we thinking about, Alan? You want to talk about Americanism?
We've got some Americanism up our sleeve. We might be talking a little bit about communism in the future, maybe some more traditional views on what we think of the world culturally and related to career, maybe even some family.
Right, maybe even a little dive into modernism and what stemmed from that.
We've also got some interviews planned you definitely will not want to miss here on Two Trade School Trads. I'm Alan Michaels.
And I'm Jack Grealis.
And you'll want to stick around and catch us next time we're on Ave Ave.
Christus Rex.